August 27, 1943. The transport truck carrying 43 Italian women prisoners of war rumbled through the gates of a makeshift detention facility outside Fort Worth, Texas, creating confusion among the American military staff who hadn't quite known what to expect. Italy's surrender to the Allies just 3 weeks earlier had created an unprecedented situation. Italian soldiers who had been enemies were suddenly being reclassified as co-belligerents, no longer fighting for the Axis, but not quite trusted as full allies either. The women who served in auxiliary roles were caught in this strange limbo, technically prisoners but treated with far less hostility than German or Japanese captives would have received. 24-year-old Rosa Marino pressed her face against the truck's canvas opening, catching glimpses of a landscape that looked nothing like her native Sicily. Instead of olive groves and ancient stone villages, she saw endless flat scrubland dotted with mesquite trees and stretched beneath a sky so vast it made her dizzy. The August heat was crushing, dry and relentless in a way that felt completely different from Mediterranean warmth. By the time the women climbed down from the truck, their gray auxiliary uniforms were soaked with sweat and dust, clung to every exposed surface of skin. The American guards waiting to receive them looked equally uncertain about how to handle Italian women prisoners. These weren't hardened Nazi operatives or fanatical Japanese soldiers. They were women who had served Mussolini's regime in administrative and support roles, many conscripted into service rather than volunteering, and most looking more exhausted than defiant. Lieutenant James Hayes, who commanded the facility, had received orders to treat them as enemy aliens under detention. But the terminology felt absurd given Italy's recent switch to the Allied side. Among the guards assembled that morning was Tommy Wade, a 26-year-old cowboy from a ranch near Abilene who had been drafted into military service despite his complete lack of interest in anything beyond horses, cattle, and the occasional Saturday night dance. Tommy stood 6 feet tall, with sun-weathered skin and a relaxed posture that suggested he had never taken military discipline entirely seriously. He watched the Italian women disembark with open curiosity, noting that several were around his age, and that despite their obvious exhaustion, they carried themselves with a pride that hadn't been beaten out of them by capture or defeat. Rosa's first impression of Texas was sensory overload. The heat, the dust, the strange flat landscape, and most overwhelming, the sounds. She had expected American military efficiency, shouted orders, harsh discipline. Instead, she heard lazy, drawling accents that made English sound like it was being spoken underwater, casual laughter among the guards, and someone in the distance playing what sounded like country music on a scratchy radio. The first week at the facility established routines that felt almost surreal in their ordinariness. The Italian women were assigned to barracks, given work duties in laundry and cleaning, and allowed limited recreation time in a fenced yard. The guards were friendly to the point of bewilderment, treating them less like enemy prisoners and more like guests who had overstayed their welcome through no fault of their own. Rosa found herself constantly disoriented by the casual American approach to everything, by guards who introduced themselves by first names and asked questions about Italian culture with genuine curiosity. It was during the evening meal on the 6th day that Rosa encountered something so shocking it made her forget, temporarily, that she was a prisoner of war. The mess hall served what the posted menu called Italian night, a gesture meant to make the Italian prisoners feel more at home. Rosa stood in the serving line with her tray, expecting perhaps a poor attempt at pasta. What she received instead made her stop dead in her tracks, causing the women behind her to bump into her in confusion. On her plate sat something flat and round, covered with what appeared to be ketchup, shredded yellow cheese that looked nothing like mozzarella, and slices of processed meat. The American server smiled proudly. "Pizza," he announced. "Figured you ladies would appreciate a taste of home." Rosa stared at the abomination before her. This wasn't pizza. This wasn't even a distant cousin of pizza. This was a crime against everything her Sicilian grandmother had taught her about food. She looked around the mess hall, and saw American guards enthusiastically eating their own portions of this culinary disaster, apparently believing they were consuming authentic Italian cuisine. She couldn't help it. She laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a full, incredulous laugh that rang through the mess hall and drew every eye to her. The laughter was partly hysteria from the stress of the past weeks, partly genuine amusement at the absurdity of Americans thinking this was pizza, and partly the first real emotion she had allowed herself to feel since her capture. Tommy Wade, sitting with other guards at a nearby table, heard the laugh and looked over. He saw Rosa holding her tray, her face a mixture of horror and amusement, staring at her food like it had personally insulted her. He stood and walked over, his cowboy boots making distinctive sounds on the linoleum floor. "Something wrong with your supper, ma'am?" he asked in his slow Texas drawl. Rosa looked up at this tall American cowboy and made a decision. Her English was limited but functional, learned in school before the war. "This," she gestured at the plate, "is not pizza. This is," she searched for the right word in English and settled on Italian, uno scherzo, a joke. Tommy's eyebrows raised. "That's pizza. Says so right on the menu board." Rosa shook her head emphatically. "No. Pizza has thin crust, fresh mozzarella, real tomatoes, olive oil, basil. Not this." She waved dismissively at the sad circle on her plate. Tommy looked at Rosa with a combination of skepticism and intrigue. "Well now, if you're such an expert, maybe you ought to show our cooks how it's supposed to be done." Rosa hadn't expected that response. She had anticipated being dismissed or told to eat what she was given without complaint. Instead, this cowboy guard was suggesting she be allowed to cook. She glanced around at the other Italian women, several of whom had been listening to the exchange with growing interest. Carlotta Russo, a 30-year-old former teacher from Naples, spoke up in Italian. "Tell him we'll make real pizza if they give us proper ingredients," Carlotta said. "Show these Americans what Italian cooking actually is." Rosa translated the offer to Tommy, who grinned with an expression that suggested he'd just been presented with entertaining possibilities. He walked over to Lieutenant Hayes, who was finishing his own dinner at the officer's table. A brief conversation ensued, with Tommy gesturing toward Rosa and the other Italian women. Lieutenant Hayes looked skeptical at first, but then something shifted in his expression. He stood and approached Rosa directly. "Miss Marino, is it?" Lieutenant Hayes said, consulting a roster he pulled from his pocket. "You're saying you can make better pizza than what we served tonight?" Rosa drew herself up to her full height of 5 feet 3 inches. "See, yes, much better. Real Italian pizza. But I need proper kitchen, proper ingredients." Lieutenant Hayes considered this for a moment. The kitchen staff had been complaining that the Italian women seemed uninterested in most of the food served, eating just enough to survive, but without any enthusiasm. Morale among prisoners was his responsibility, and if allowing them to cook their own food improved their spirits, it seemed like a reasonable accommodation. Besides, Italy was technically on the Allied side now, even if the political situation remained complicated. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow afternoon, you can use the kitchen for 2 hours. Make your pizza. Show us what we've been doing wrong. But," he added with a stern look, "this is a privilege that can be revoked if there are any problems. Understood?" Rosa nodded eagerly, already mentally cataloging what ingredients she would need. That evening, the Italian women gathered in their barracks with an energy that had been absent since their arrival. Rosa, Carlotta, and 5 others who had experience cooking began planning. They would need to work with whatever ingredients the American military kitchen had available, which meant improvising in ways that would make their grandmothers weep. But they were determined to create something that at least resembled authentic pizza. The next afternoon, Rosa and her team entered the kitchen with a mixture of nervousness and determination. The American cooks watched with obvious skepticism as the Italian women took over their workspace. Rosa surveyed the American military kitchen with the critical eye of someone whose Sicilian grandmother had trained her in the sacred art of Italian cooking from childhood. The ingredients available were far from ideal. No fresh mozzarella, only blocks of something called mozzarella cheese, that bore little resemblance to the real thing. No San Marzano tomatoes, just canned tomato sauce. No fresh basil, though she found dried herbs in the pantry. But she had flour, yeast, olive oil, and most importantly, she had knowledge passed down through generations of Italian women who understood that food was love made edible. She began making dough, her hands moving with practiced confidence as she combined flour, water, yeast, and salt. The other Italian women worked alongside her, each taking on roles they had performed countless times in their own kitchens back home. Carlotta prepared the sauce, doctoring the canned tomatoes with garlic, oregano, and a touch of sugar to balance the acidity. Maria Benedetti, a quiet woman from Rome, sliced the cheese with careful precision while singing a Neapolitan folk song under her breath. Tommy Wade had positioned himself near the kitchen entrance, officially there to supervise the prisoners, but actually fascinated by watching them work. The transformation was remarkable. These women who had seemed defeated and exhausted just days earlier now moved with purpose and joy, their hands busy with tasks that clearly connected them to something deeper than just making food. They laughed, argued in rapid Italian about the proper way to stretch dough, and occasionally broke into song. "What were you singing about?" Tommy asked during one particularly energetic verse. Rosa looked up from kneading dough, flour dusting her cheeks. "His old song about Naples, about making pizza for big family gathering." She paused, then added quietly, "About home." Tommy nodded, understanding suddenly that this wasn't just about proving American pizza was inferior. This was about holding on to identity, about maintaining connection to a homeland these women might never see again. He watched Rosa's hands work the dough with a gentleness that seemed at odds with her earlier defiance, and he found himself wanting to understand more about where she came from, what her life had been like before war turned everyone into enemies. "Can I help?" he asked impulsively. Rosa looked at him with surprise. "You want to learn make pizza? Why not?" Tommy shrugged. "I can follow directions. Used to help my mama in the kitchen before I got too big and clumsy for her liking." Rosa considered this, then gestured him forward. "Okay, cowboy. Come, I teach you." What followed was the beginning of something unprecedented in the facility's brief history. Tommy Wade, Texas cowboy and military guard, stood elbow to elbow with Rosa Marino, Italian prisoner of war, learning to stretch pizza dough. His first attempts were disasters, the dough tearing and bunching under his inexperienced hands. Rosa laughed at Tommy's clumsy attempts, but it was warm laughter without mockery. No, she demonstrated again. "Gentle. Like you touch something precious. The dough, she is alive. You must respect her." By the time the pizzas emerged from the oven an hour later, word had spread throughout the facility. Guards, cooks, and even Lieutenant Hayes gathered in the mess hall to witness the results. Rosa carried the first pizza to a table with ceremonial care. The crust was golden and blistered, the cheese melted properly, the sauce fragrant with garlic and herbs. It wasn't perfect by Italian standards, constrained as they were by American ingredients, but it was unmistakably, authentically pizza. Tommy took the first bite at Rosa's insistence. His eyes widened. "Holy hell," he said, then remembered his manners. "I mean, ma'am, this is nothing like what we had yesterday. This is actually good. Really good." Other guards crowded around, and soon the Italian women were serving slices to a mess hall full of Americans who had never tasted authentic Italian food. The response was unanimous and enthusiastic. Within an hour, Tommy was begging Rosa to teach him more, and other guards were asking when the Italian women could cook again. This became a regular occurrence. 3 times a week, the Italian women were given access to the kitchen, and what started as a simple morale initiative evolved into informal cultural exchange. Cowboys learned to make pasta from scratch, to understand that garlic shouldn't be burnt, that olive oil was sacred. The Italian women learned about Texas barbecue, about chili that bore no resemblance to anything in Italian cuisine, about American hospitality that expressed itself through generous portions and casual warmth. But this honeymoon period was interrupted in late September when Red Cross letters began arriving from Italy. Rosa received hers on a Thursday morning, and the news it contained shattered the comfortable routine they had established. Her mother wrote from their village in Sicily, describing civil war that had erupted after Mussolini's fall. Italian partisans fought against fascist loyalists and German occupiers. Their village had changed hands 3 times in as many weeks. Rosa's brother Marco had joined the partisans and was somewhere in the mountains, fighting former countrymen who still pledged loyalty to Mussolini's puppet republic in the north. Most devastating was her mother's question, written in shaking handwriting at the letter's end. "Rosa, did you know what Mussolini was doing? The things the fascists did to people who disagreed, the way they helped the Germans round up Jews, the prison camps. Everyone is saying they didn't know, but how could we not have known? What kind of Italians were we?" Rosa sat in the barracks clutching the letter, feeling her understanding of herself crumble. Around the barracks, similar scenes played out as other women received letters from Italy. Carlotta learned that her husband, who had served in the Italian army, was now imprisoned by the Allies for war crimes connected to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. Maria discovered that her Jewish neighbors in Rome had been deported to German camps before the Italian government fell, rounded up with the full cooperation of Italian police. The comfortable narrative they had maintained, that they had simply been serving their country in administrative roles, supporting what they believed was national defense, collapsed under the weight of documented atrocities. That evening was scheduled for another cooking session. Rosa almost didn't go, couldn't imagine finding the energy to perform cultural exchange when she felt hollowed out by shame. But Carlotta convinced her. "We must still eat," she said quietly. "And maybe the Americans deserve to see us as we truly are now, without the pretense that we were innocent bystanders to what our country became." The kitchen felt different that night. The Italian women worked in near silence, preparing pasta carbonara with the limited ingredients available. Tommy noticed immediately that something had changed. The laughter was gone, replaced by grim determination. Rosa's hands moved mechanically through familiar motions, but her eyes were distant. "What happened?" Tommy asked, standing beside her at the counter. Rosa continued stirring sauce, not meeting his eyes. "We received letters from home, from Italy. We learned things about what Mussolini's government did, what our country did while we served it." She finally looked at him, tears threatening to spill. "We thought we were patriots, Tommy. We thought we were defending Italy. But we were part of something terrible. And we did not even know it, or maybe we did not want to know." Lieutenant Hayes had received intelligence briefings about Italy's role in Axis atrocities, about the fascist regime's collaboration with Nazi Germany, about prison camps and political murders. He approached the kitchen table where the Italian women had gathered, carrying newspapers that contained accounts of these crimes now being exposed as Allied forces advanced through Italy. "I think you should see these," he said quietly, placing the papers on the table. "Not to punish you, but because you deserve to understand the full truth about what you were part of, whether you knew it or not." The women read in silence, passing the newspapers between them. Articles detailed Italy's racial laws against Jews, the brutal occupation of Ethiopia, where chemical weapons had been used against civilians, the prison islands where political dissidents were sent to die, the enthusiastic participation of Italian police in German deportation orders. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Rosa finished reading and set the newspaper down with trembling hands. Around the table, her fellow prisoners sat in various states of distress. Some wept quietly. Others stared at nothing, their faces reflecting the internal collapse of everything they had believed about their service to Italy. The pasta they had prepared sat cooling on the stove, temporarily forgotten in the face of this moral reckoning. Tommy Wade felt deeply uncomfortable witnessing their anguish, but couldn't bring himself to leave. He had fought in North Africa, had seen Italian soldiers surrender by the thousands after the tide turned against the Axis. He had been taught to see them as enemies, but standing in this kitchen watching women confront the sins of their government, he saw only humans grappling with unbearable guilt. "You didn't do those things personally," Tommy offered awkwardly. "You weren't soldiers. You were office workers, radio operators, support staff. Carlotta looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. Does that matter? We served the government that did these things. We saluted Mussolini's flag. We believed in the glory of the Italian Empire. Her voice broke. We were fools, or cowards, or both. Either we did not know because we chose not to look, or we knew and pretended not to understand. Lieutenant Hayes pulled up a chair and sat at the table with them, an action that violated typical protocols about maintaining distance between captors and prisoners. Listen, he said. My father fought in the Great War, came home talking about how ordinary German soldiers weren't monsters. They were just men following orders, believing what their government told them. Same thing here. You can't change what Italy did under Mussolini, but you can choose who you become, knowing what you know now. The question, Rosa said quietly, is what do we become? Where do we even belong anymore? The question of belonging became more urgent as autumn advanced toward winter. News from Italy remained chaotic. The country was fractured between Allied-controlled South and German-occupied North, where Mussolini's puppet republic still functioned. Civil war raged between partisans and fascist loyalists. Cities were being destroyed in the fighting. Food shortages approached famine levels. The Italy these women had left no longer existed in any recognizable form. In November, Lieutenant Hayes received preliminary orders about eventual repatriation procedures. Italian prisoners would be returned to Allied-controlled portions of Italy once the security situation stabilized, likely sometime in the spring of 1944. He shared this information with the women during one of their now regular kitchen gatherings, expecting relief or at least acknowledgement that this was what they had been waiting for. Instead, he saw fear. Rosa spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. Lieutenant, what if some of us do not wish to return immediately? What if Italy is too broken, too dangerous, too full of ghosts we are not ready to face? The question hung in the kitchen air that smelled of garlic and tomato sauce. Hayes looked around the table at faces that had become familiar over the past months. These weren't abstract enemy prisoners anymore. They were Rosa, who had patiently taught him the difference between al dente and overcooked pasta. They were Carlotta, who sang while she cooked and told stories about teaching literature to Roman school children. They were Maria, quiet and careful, who made the best focaccia anyone at the facility had ever tasted. I don't know if that's possible, Hayes admitted. You're technically still enemy aliens, even though Italy is cooperating with the Allies now. But he paused, thinking, let me look into it, see what options might exist. What happened next surprised everyone, including Lieutenant Hayes himself. Word had spread beyond the military facility about the Italian women and their cooking. Guards went home on leave talking about authentic Italian food, about women who could transform basic ingredients into something remarkable. Local newspapers ran a human interest story about enemy prisoners teaching Texas cowboys to make pasta. The coverage was generally sympathetic, emphasizing Italy's switch to the Allied side and framing the women as refugees from fascism rather than its supporters. Tommy Wade's mother, Susan Wade, read the article in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and made a decision. She drove to the facility with 3 other ranch wives and requested a meeting with Lieutenant Hayes. These Italian women, Mrs. Wade said without preamble. The ones who can cook. Do any of them need sponsors to stay in America? Lieutenant Hayes was caught completely off guard. Ma'am, they're prisoners of war. The procedures for allowing them to remain are complicated. Then start uncomplicating them, Mrs. Wade said with the directness that had made her a successful ranch owner after her husband's death 5 years earlier. Fort Worth doesn't have a single decent Italian restaurant. These women have skills we need, and from what my Tommy tells me, they don't have much waiting for them back in Italy. Seems like a situation where everybody wins, if we can work something out. Other local families came forward with similar offers. The owner of a downtown building offered to lease space below market rate for an Italian restaurant. A food supplier offered wholesale prices on ingredients. Several families volunteered to provide housing for Italian women while they established themselves. What had started as a military detention situation was transforming into something unprecedented. A community adoption of former enemy prisoners. Lieutenant Hayes worked channels he barely understood, contacting immigration officials, military liaisons, and State Department representatives. The unique circumstances helped their case. Italy was no longer an enemy nation, but an allied co-belligerent. The women had skills that could benefit American communities. They had American sponsors willing to vouch for them and provide employment. Most importantly, they had demonstrated genuine transformation, acknowledging their former government's crimes and expressing desire to build better lives. By March 1944, provisional approval came through. Italian prisoners at the Fort Worth facility could apply for reclassification as displaced persons and sponsor-based immigration, allowing them to remain in America if they chose. The decision was voluntary. Those who wished to return to Italy would be repatriated as originally planned. The announcement created division among the women that mirrored their conflicted feelings about identity and belonging. Of the 43 women at the facility, 27 chose to return to Italy. They felt a duty to help rebuild their broken homeland, to face whatever awaited them with courage rather than flee to comfort in America. Carlotta Russo was among them. "I must go back," she explained to Rosa during a late-night conversation in their barracks. "Italy needs teachers who understand what went wrong, who can help the next generation avoid the mistakes we made. I cannot do that from Texas." Rosa understood, even as it broke her heart to lose her friend. She was among the 16 women who chose to stay. Her reasons were complex: fear of returning to a country at war with itself, shame about facing her family, knowing what she had unknowingly supported, but also, genuinely, hope about building something new in America, about being part of the bridge between two cultures that had learned to see past their differences. The farewell gathering in April was held in the kitchen, the space that had become sacred ground for their transformation. The women who were leaving helped cook one final meal alongside those who were staying. They made dishes from every region of Italy, represented among them Sicilian arancini, Roman cacio e pepe, Neapolitan ragu, Tuscan ribollita. The American guards and staff who had become friends over the past months joined them, and the kitchen overflowed with the mingled aromas of Italian cooking and Texas barbecue that someone had contributed to the feast. Tommy sat beside Rosa, their shoulders touching in a way that had become natural over months of cooking lessons and conversations. "You sure about staying?" he asked quietly. "It's not too late to change your mind." Rosa looked at him with a small smile. "I am sure. Italy will always be my first home. But Texas," she gestured around the crowded kitchen, "this has become home too. Different home, but real." 25 years later, in the spring of 1969, Rosa Marino Wade stood before a packed conference room at a food journalism convention in Dallas, preparing to address an audience about the role of immigrant cuisine in American culture. At 49 years old, she still moved with the grace of someone comfortable in kitchens, though her hands now bore the scars and calluses of decades spent cooking professionally. In the front row sat Tommy Wade, her husband of 23 years, grinning with the same easy smile that had first appeared when she laughed at American pizza all those years ago. Their 4 children occupied the seats beside him, the oldest, Maria, now 22, and managing the family's second restaurant location, and the youngest, James, barely 16, and already showing culinary talent that made Rosa's heart swell with pride. Rosa's trattoria had become a Fort Worth institution. What started as a small restaurant sponsored by local families had grown into a beloved establishment where 3 generations of Texans had learned what authentic Italian food tasted like. But Rosa never let success erase the memory of how it began. The walls of her restaurant displayed photographs from those early days at the POW facility, images of Italian women teaching cowboys to make pasta, of that first real pizza emerging from a military kitchen oven, of friendships forming across enemy lines through the universal language of food. The story Rosa told that day had been told countless times, but it never lost its power. She spoke of arriving in Texas as a prisoner, of being shocked by what Americans called pizza, of the unexpected kindness that flowed when cultural barriers dissolved in kitchens filled with the aromas of garlic and tomatoes. She described how food became the bridge that allowed enemies to see each other as simply humans, who all needed to eat, who all carried memories of family meals and recipes passed down through generations. "We came as prisoners," Rosa told her audience. "We left as friends, some of us as family. All because a cowboy challenged me to prove I could make better pizza than what the army served." She looked at Tommy and smiled. "Best challenge I ever accepted." Carlotta Russo, who had returned to Italy in 1944, had sent a letter that arrived just before the conference. Rosa read portions of it aloud. Carlotta had become a respected educator in Rome, teaching literature and civic responsibility to students who had grown up in the shadow of fascism's collapse. She wrote about how the recipes Rosa sent in letters over the years had connected her to memories of that Texas kitchen, how she taught her own students that reconciliation often begins with breaking bread together. The 16 women who stayed in Texas had all built successful lives.